An American P-51 Mustang was escorting heavy bombers during a daylight raid over Germany in the spring of 1944. Ahead of it flew tight formations of B-17s. Their crews still had to cross a large stretch of enemy territory, reach the target, endure anti-aircraft fire, release their bombs, and then make the same long trip back to their airfields in England. The escort fighters' job looked simple only on a map. They had to hold formation, watch their fuel, avoid losing the bombers in the clouds, and spot German aircraft before those aircraft could organize an attack. The greatest danger often did not appear directly ahead. It came from above, out of the sun, or from behind, where a small dark shape might remain invisible until the first burst of gunfire. The German fighters appeared beside the formation without warning. Several aircraft tried to break toward the bombers from one direction, while others tied up the American escort. One Bf-109 crossed in front of the Mustang, turned sharply, and began to descend. The American pilot turned after it and fired a short burst. He did not see any hits, but almost immediately, a pale trail appeared behind the German fighter. One wing dropped, and the aircraft slowed noticeably. From the Mustang's cockpit, it looked as though the bullets had damaged the cooling system or struck the engine. The Bf-109 no longer tried to escape in a steep dive. It descended unevenly, rocking from one wing to the other. The American followed. That was exactly what the German pilot wanted. The trap did not depend on a secret smoke button or some remarkable feature of the German aircraft. In a real dogfight, a pilot could reduce power, enter a controlled slip, lower one wing, and allow the pursuer to believe that the aircraft was barely under control. If gunfire had just passed close by, even a brief trail of vapor or coolant could make the illusion especially convincing. The idea was simple. The Mustang would close rapidly on the slowing aircraft. Its pilot would focus on the gun sight, come in too close and fail to shed speed in time. Then the Bf-109 would suddenly apply power, pull its nose up, and enter a steep climbing turn. The American would overshoot, and the German would emerge behind him. Pilots on every side tried variations of this kind of overshoot trap. They did not always look the same. Sometimes a pilot chopped the throttle. Sometimes he added a slip or pretended that he could no longer hold altitude. Sometimes he waited until the pursuer almost filled his rearview mirror before beginning the maneuver. Success depended on a precise feel for speed and on how badly the pursuing pilot wanted a quick victory. The American kept closing, but several details bothered him. The German fighter recovered too cleanly from each supposedly uncontrolled bank. Its pilot kept looking back, apparently watching the distance to the Mustang rather than the condition of his own aircraft. Finally, the Bf-109 began losing speed at exactly the moment the American reached a dangerous range. None of this proved that the German was faking. A wounded pilot also looks behind him to see whether the enemy is still attacking. But the American did not need to know exactly what was happening. He only had to assume the worst and refused to let the German choose the exact moment of the next maneuver. So he did not rush in until he was almost touching the target. He kept some speed in reserve and left room above the fight. From the German cockpit, it could still appear that the young American had believed the damage and was continuing the chase. A few seconds later, the Bf-109 snapped its nose upward. The German pilot began the maneuver for which he had been slowing down. He expected the faster Mustang to continue along its original flight path and pass directly in front of his guns. But the American did not follow the turn. He pulled upward and converted part of his speed into altitude. In aerial combat, this allowed a pursuer to reduce the rate of closure without surrendering the initiative. In later training materials and pilot accounts, movements of this kind were often described as a high yo-yo. The attacker rises above the plane of the turn, then comes back down from above. The German completed his turn lower and slower. Instead of seeing the Mustang in front of him, he lost sight of it for several seconds. The American fighter was now above him. It rolled back toward the fight and attacked again. The entire situation had reversed. The Bf-109 had already spent much of its speed in the abrupt climb and turn. The Mustang still had altitude in reserve and could choose when to close. The German pilot had placed himself in the very position he had intended for his opponent. Lower, slower, and with his back to the attack. The American fired a short burst. This time, the hits were visible. Thick smoke poured from the German fighter, and it fell away. The Mustang did not follow it all the way to the ground. It turned back toward the bombers. For an escort pilot, a personal victory did not cancel the main mission. Other German fighters might still try to break into the formation. This scene is not a word-for-word account of a documented fight between two identified pilots. It is a composite reconstruction based on real methods of aerial combat: false deceleration, an attempt to force an overshoot, a climbing reversal, and the pursuer's decision to move upward in response. Variations of such situations occurred throughout the war, and accounts from both sides describe pilots pretending to be damaged or suddenly changing the tempo of a fight. That is precisely why the story matters. It raises a question that goes beyond one dogfight. Why would an experienced German pilot assume that a young American would fall for an old trick? And why, by 1944, was that assumption becoming less reliable? The answer had to do with more than the performance of the P-51 or the personal talent of one pilot. Behind the American was a training system that tried to turn the experience of earlier battles into practical rules for the next group of replacements. The German might possess far more personal combat experience. The American might be meeting the enemy over Germany for the first time. But that did not mean he had never heard of an overshoot trap, the need to preserve altitude, or the danger of a target that seemed almost too easy. From the ground, a crippled aircraft can appear obvious. It is burning, breaking apart, or falling out of control. At several thousand feet, the situation was far less clear. Black smoke could mean fire, but it could also be oil. A white trail might come from a damaged cooling system. An unusual slip might be caused by a damaged wing, or it might be deliberate. Even a rapid loss of altitude did not necessarily mean that the pilot had lost control. For that reason, pilots were taught to judge the entire picture rather than one sign. A badly damaged aircraft usually behaved unpredictably. It responded poorly to control inputs, struggled to hold a heading, and lost speed whether the pilot wanted it to or not. But if the aircraft recovered at convenient moments, still maneuvered with precision, and its pilot kept checking the pursuer's position, the apparent damage might be part of a trap. Naturally, American flight schools did not offer a mandatory class titled "The German Pretends to be Shot Down." Training worked differently. Cadets learned to watch the rate of closure, preserve an altitude advantage, avoid fixating on one target, expect an overshoot attempt, and always leave themselves a way out of an attack. From those principles, a pilot could build his own answer to a specific situation. An American Air Combat Manual published in 1942 warned directly that no single rule could cover every engagement. The enemy changed tactics, different aircraft had different advantages, and events developed too quickly. The fundamentals, therefore, remained constant: surprise, speed, altitude, mutual support, and the continual revision of tactics based on combat experience. For a pilot, that meant one simple thing: he could not allow the enemy to control the entire fight. If a German slowed down, the American had to think not only about how to close the distance, but why the German wanted him to close it. If the enemy entered a hard maneuver, there was no requirement to copy it. Sometimes the better choice was to preserve energy, climb, and return when the opponent had spent his own speed. Early in the war, German veterans often did hold the advantage in situations like these. They saw danger sooner, judged distance more accurately, and knew how to exploit an inexperienced opponent. The United States tried to narrow that gap not by waiting for every young pilot to survive dozens of battles on his own, but through mass training and the deliberate transfer of other men's experience. An American pilot's path to a combat unit began with several stages of instruction. First came the light trainer: takeoffs, landings, basic maneuvers, and emergency procedures. Then he moved to faster aircraft and learned navigation, instrument flying, formation work, radio procedures, and oxygen equipment. Later stages added aerial gunnery, ground attack, and practice dogfights. Earning his wings did not end the process. A future fighter pilot still had to master a specific combat aircraft and become accustomed to its powerful engine, high landing speed, wide turning radius, and behavior at altitude. Flying as a pair and as part of a flight received separate attention. The American system was built on the idea that a good fighter pilot was not simply a lone man who could throw an airplane around impressively. He had to complete a mission as part of a group. The program was not perfect. The rapid expansion of the Army Air Forces created shortages of experienced instructors, crowded training fields, and serious accidents. Training schedules changed during different periods of the war. Even so, the United States could provide something that later became increasingly unavailable to Germany: extensive training hours, enough fuel, and time to correct mistakes before a pilot entered combat. After arriving in Britain, an American pilot trained again. The European theater demanded skills that could not be learned completely over Texas or California. He had to become familiar with English weather, dense cloud cover, short winter days, flights over the North Sea, and the possibility of returning to an airfield that had suddenly disappeared under fog. Pilots were introduced to mission routes, radio procedures, ground control systems, the characteristics of German aircraft, and rescue procedures over water. Aircraft recognition was not practiced only from perfect side profile photographs. In combat, a BF-109 or FW-190 was more likely to appear for a few seconds from above, from below, in a turn, or head-on. A recognition mistake could lead either to firing on a friendly aircraft or to losing the only chance to shoot. Special training units in England prepared replacement pilots for American fighter groups. The 496th Fighter Training Group, for example, trained P-38 and P-51 pilots before they joined operational units. In 10 months, nearly 2,500 airmen of different categories passed through the group. They attended ground classes, took examinations, flew combat types, learned local operating conditions, and, whenever possible, trained under instructors who had recently returned from combat units. An instructor like that could explain what no performance chart could show. He could tell a replacement why it was dangerous to watch a falling aircraft for too long, how a German pair protected one another, why one fighter might deliberately show itself while a second remained above, why chasing an enemy all the way to the ground could be fatal, how quickly fuel disappeared during a prolonged fight, and why losing the formation above the clouds might be more dangerous than the enemy himself. Post-mission debriefings were equally important. A pilot returned to base and reported where he had met the enemy, the altitude from which the attack began, how the German formation had operated, and why the American formation had held together or broken apart. Gun camera film helped confirm victory claims and also exposed mistakes in aim. Intelligence officers compared the accounts of different crews, and useful observations were passed to other units. So the phrase, "the American had already seen this in training," should not be taken literally. He might never have watched an instructor reproduce the exact scene of a BF-109 dropping one wing and pretending to be damaged. But he had already been taught the logic behind the deception. He knew that a pursuer could not stare only through the gun sight, that abrupt deceleration was often intended to cause an overshoot, that an inviting target might be bait, that the enemy's wingman might be above, and that altitude could be worth more than a few additional seconds of pursuit. Training also had to control a pilot's natural excitement. After a successful burst, he wanted to make certain that the enemy was truly going down. That mattered psychologically, and it mattered when a victory had to be confirmed. But it was also the moment when he stopped watching the rest of the sky. A German wingman might attack from above, or the apparently damaged aircraft might recover and rejoin the fight. Instructors repeated the same warning. An aircraft remained dangerous as long as it could maneuver and fire its weapons. But that did not mean it should automatically be followed to the ground. The mission order determined the primary task. For an escort pilot, that task was still the protection of the bombers. This point is essential to understanding the air war over Germany. In 1943, the American 8th Air Force suffered heavy losses during deep daylight raids. The concentrated defensive fire of the B-17S and B-24S was dangerous to attackers, but it could not fully replace fighter escort. As long as the escorts had limited range, German units could wait for the American fighters to turn back and then attack the bombers deep inside Germany. The situation began to change with drop tanks, the increasing range of the P-47, and the arrival of the P-51 in large numbers. The Mustang combined long range with strong, high-altitude performance and could remain with the heavy bombers much farther into enemy territory. By early 1944, German pilots found it increasingly difficult to locate a section of the route where the bombers were unprotected. During Big Week, from February 20th through February 25th, 1944, American and British Air Forces struck a series of targets in the German aircraft industry. The offensive had another purpose as well: to force the Luftwaffe to send up its fighters and engage an increasingly powerful American escort force. The pressure continued to grow in the months that followed. Mustangs appeared over central Germany, escorted raids to Berlin, and increasingly met German fighters before they could reach the bomber formations. That did not mean the P-51 automatically won every engagement. It gave its pilot range, speed, excellent high-altitude performance, and heavy firepower, but a poor decision could erase any technical advantage. A pilot could bleed away his speed in a prolonged turn, stray too far from his group, misjudge his fuel, or open fire from excessive range. The purpose of American training was to use the aircraft's strengths in service of the mission. If an enemy tried to drag a Mustang into a slow fight where it was uncomfortable, the American could climb away and return with a speed advantage. If a German dived toward the ground, the escort pilot had to decide whether the pursuit was worth the risk of leaving the bombers uncovered. Heavy bomber crews called the escort fighters their little friends. A B-17 carried as many as 10 men. They worked inside an unheated aircraft, depended on oxygen masks, fought off attacks with machine gun fire, and could not turn sharply without breaking the formation apart. To them, the appearance of a P-51 nearby was not a picturesque feature of an aerial parade. It was a real increase in the odds of returning to England. That is why the American in the opening reconstruction does not dive after the damaged Bf-109 all the way to the ground. He returns to the bombers. The decision is less dramatic than a long chase, but it is what separates personal hunting from the execution of a combat mission. German pilots, of course, did not hold a monopoly on aerial deception. Americans also used feints, decoys, and maneuvers designed to produce the wrong reaction from an opponent. Sometimes a new tactic came from the study of aircraft performance. Sometimes it emerged in combat and was later spread through instructors and debriefings. One of the best-known examples did not come from Europe at all, but from the Pacific. Before the United States entered the war, Navy pilot John Thatch studied the available information about the Japanese Zero. The Zero outclassed the American F-4F Wildcat in maneuverability and climb performance. Trying to beat it in a conventional one-on-one turning fight was extremely dangerous. Thatch searched for an answer by moving matchsticks across a table as if they were aircraft. The result was a mutual support maneuver that became known as the Thatch Weave. Two American fighters moved apart, then turned toward one another. If a Japanese pilot followed one aircraft, he gradually entered the firing arc of the other. The important point was not that the Wildcat suddenly became a better aircraft than the Zero. The Americans changed the problem itself. The Japanese pilot expected to use his aircraft's advantage against one opponent, and instead found himself between two pilots who trusted one another and followed a plan both understood. Different aircraft and formations were used in Europe, but the principle of mutual support remained the same. The leader attacked while the wingman protected the pair's rear. One American fighter might deliberately appear to be an easy target, while the second remained higher and off to one side. The German began the chase and discovered only after closing in that the lone Mustang had been bait. Pilots also tried to force a pursuer to overshoot. They cut speed sharply, changed direction, or pulled into a steep climb. But such maneuvers were risky. If the pursuer recognized the plan in time or maintained enough separation, the pilot setting the trap could find himself out of speed and exposed. That is what happens in the opening reconstruction. The German expects the American to continue closing in the same plane. The American does not try to win the same maneuver by turning harder. He uses the P-51's speed, climbs above the fight, and returns after the Bf-109 has spent its energy. Both sides also use the sun, the clouds, and the limits of human vision. Fighters approached from below against the ground or from above out of the glare. One formation might reveal itself from one direction and draw away the escort, while another approached the bombers from the opposite side. German single-engine fighters could occupy the American escort, while heavier aircraft prepared to attack the bomber stream. The Americans answered not only with individual maneuvers, but with an organized escort system. New fighter groups met the bombers along different parts of the route. Some covered them near the coast, others took over deeper inside Europe, and still others operated near the target. German pilots found it increasingly difficult to wait for a point at which the American escorts had run out of fuel. By 1944, 8th Air Force fighter groups were increasingly allowed to operate more aggressively. Some flew ahead of the bombers, searched for German formations, and prevented them from assembling for a mass attack. After completing the primary mission, American fighters could strike airfields and other targets on the ground. For the Luftwaffe, this meant that the battle could begin before its pilots ever came near the B-17S. Freedom of action did not mean that every pilot could ignore his orders in pursuit of a personal score. Destroying a German fighter was valuable, but breaking up an attack was also a success. If the enemy was forced to drop his external tanks, burn fuel, lose formation, and turn for home, the bombers could continue even if no new victory marking appeared on the side of a P-51. Air tactics changed constantly. A successful maneuver rarely remained secret for long. After a mission, pilots described how the enemy had operated, which attacks had been repeated, and at what moment the danger had appeared. Instructors turned those observations into training problems. Gun camera film revealed whether the correct firing distance had been chosen. One man's mistake could become a warning for dozens of pilots who followed him. That was the central advantage of the system. It did not make Americans invulnerable, and it did not eliminate defeat. But it reduced the chance that the same deception would keep working on new pilots simply because no one had warned them about it. At the beginning of World War II, the balance had looked very different. The Luftwaffe entered the conflict with a powerful corps of career airmen. Some German pilots had gained combat experience in Spain, then fought in Poland, France, the Battle of Britain, the Balkans, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. By the time Americans began appearing over Germany in large numbers, some Luftwaffe veterans had already flown hundreds of combat missions. A pilot like that could read an opponent's intention from a small change in the angle of a wing. He knew his own aircraft, knew how quickly it would lose speed in a climb, and understood exactly how close he could allow a pursuer to come. In an individual encounter, a German veteran remained extraordinarily dangerous even after the Luftwaffe's overall position had begun to deteriorate. But the German system for employing its pilots came at a heavy cost. The best airmen usually continued flying combat without a short, fixed tour of duty. They accumulated enormous personal experience, but stayed at the front until they were wounded, killed, transferred, or completely exhausted. As long as a veteran remained operational, he was a formidable opponent. When he was lost, much of his knowledge disappeared with him. The American approach more often included rotation out of combat. After a certain number of missions, an experienced pilot might be sent on leave, returned to the United States, assigned to staff work, or made an instructor. This limited the personal scores of some individual aces, but it allowed their practical knowledge to reach much larger groups of cadets. The difference became especially clear in 1944. According to a study of the American training system, replacement pilots arriving in U.S. Army Air Force's combat units during the summer of 1944 averaged roughly 360 total flight hours. German replacements at the same point often had around 100 hours or less. Those figures did not determine the automatic outcome of a dogfight. A German with 100 hours might be more talented than an American with 360. An experienced Luftwaffe ace could easily defeat an inattentive opponent. But across thousands of pilots, those additional hours mattered enormously. The American cadet had more opportunities to make a difficult landing, lose and regain his place in formation, practice gunnery, make a mistake in a training fight, and hear an instructor explain what went wrong. He became familiar with a combat aircraft before real shells began passing nearby. The German newcomer increasingly had to learn the missing lessons after joining an operational unit. The loss of instructors was not the only reason. Germany faced an increasingly severe shortage of aviation fuel. Allied attacks on the oil industry and transportation network reduced the available supply of gasoline. Aircraft continued to leave the factories, but a long training program consumed fuel that combat units also desperately needed. German cadets received fewer flight hours. Conversion to an operational fighter became shorter. A young pilot might understand the basics of flying, but have very little time in a BF-109 or FW-190. After reaching a frontline unit, he had to master the aircraft, learn to remain with the formation, and survive encounters with American pilots who had received far more training time. A vicious cycle developed. New pilots needed veterans to guide them. That forced the veterans to enter combat more often, where they suffered further losses. The fewer experienced men remained, the harder it became to train the next group of replacements. Weaker training increased losses, and higher losses weakened training again. The American system moved in the opposite direction. The nation's economic strength supported a vast training network, allowed fuel to be spent on practice missions, and replaced aircraft lost in accidents or combat. Veterans passed on their experience at airfields in the United States and Britain. A newcomer joined a squadron, was assigned to a pair, and flew beside men who had already completed combat missions. None of this means every American unit operated perfectly. Young pilots became lost in cloud, broke formation, confused landmarks, dropped their external tanks too early, and allowed themselves to be drawn into reckless chases. Collisions and accidents occurred. Sometimes a German trick worked precisely because an American forgot what he had been taught. But the United States had the ability to correct mistakes on a large scale. A failed mission was analyzed. A new enemy tactic was reported to other units. Instructions changed. A pilot could make several mistakes at a training field and survive them, while a German newcomer increasingly had to learn during his first actual battle. The enemy itself recognized the improving quality of American pilots. Leaders of the German fighter force noted that by 1944, the Americans were much stronger than they had been during the first months of their mass appearance over Europe. They held formation better, flew with greater confidence, used altitude effectively, and were less likely to be drawn into a disadvantageous pursuit. For that reason, the confident German ace in the opening scene fits the broader logic of the period, even though the fight itself is a reconstruction. A veteran truly might have possessed far more personal experience and seen a young opponent in front of him. His mistake would not have been believing in his own ability without reason. It would have been assuming that youth automatically meant ignorance of old tactical tricks. The American pilot might have been entering a real dogfight for the first time, but by then he had already passed through a long chain of instruction. Before him, other pilots had encountered false deceleration, fallen into traps, escaped, returned, and described what had happened. Instructors converted their experiences into rules. Preserve altitude, control the rate of closure, do not look only at the target, and never declare an opponent helpless too soon. That was how the personal trick of one ace collided not merely with the reaction of another man, but with the work of an entire system. To understand why an overshoot trap could work at all, it is important to remember that aerial combat was not a contest between published maximum speeds. A P-51 could be faster than a Bf-109 under one set of conditions and at a disadvantage under another. Altitude, remaining fuel, external tanks, wind direction, engine condition, and speed at the beginning of the maneuver all affected the result. An aircraft with greater speed held an advantage only as long as the pilot managed that speed correctly. If a Mustang closed rapidly on a slower target while keeping its nose pointed directly at it, the distance could disappear too quickly. The attacker had to come close enough to fire, but excessive closure created the risk of an overshoot. Once the attacker passed ahead, the target could reverse and fire back. A German pilot pretending to be damaged was trying to exploit that exact problem. He did not need to stop his aircraft in mid-air. He only had to create a noticeable difference in speed and make the American realize too late that the range was collapsing faster than expected. The pursuer had several choices. He could reduce power and lower flaps, but abrupt braking reduced maneuverability and threw away valuable energy. He could turn off to one side, but then he surrendered a favorable attacking position. Often the better solution was to go upward. The aircraft traded speed for altitude, remained maneuverable, and stayed above the opponent. Altitude acted like a bank account in aerial combat. An aircraft above could convert it back into speed simply by lowering its nose. An aircraft below had to spend energy to climb. That was why instructors constantly emphasized the advantage of altitude, and why experienced pilots tried not to throw it away during an overly long pursuit. The high yo-yo was not an American invention, nor did it belong to one type of fighter. It was a general method of controlling closure, but it suited the strengths of the P-51. An American could use his speed, rise above the turn, and then attack again from above instead of trying to follow a Bf-109 around the tightest possible path. German veterans used the same basic logic against their opponents. They tried to attack from altitude, strike quickly, and avoid remaining in a prolonged fight without a reason. On the Eastern Front, in North Africa, and over Europe, experienced pilots learned to choose the moment when an enemy was distracted, separated from his formation, or occupied with another target. One of the oldest tricks was an attack out of the sun. The glare made an approaching aircraft difficult to see and made range harder to judge. Another option was to approach against the ground or cloud cover, where a small silhouette disappeared among the patterns below. Some formations exposed themselves deliberately, forcing the enemy to turn toward them, while the real attack came from another direction. A false retreat could be used as well. One aircraft pulled away as though it had fallen behind or lost formation, while its companions took position above. The enemy saw an isolated target, began to descend, and exposed himself to the covering fighters. American pilots later described the method in simple language. One man dragged the enemy, and the other cleared him off the tail. Radio communication gave American formations an important advantage in situations like these. Pilots could warn one another of danger, report the direction of an attack, and call for help. Radio did not eliminate chaos. Voices overlapped, calls were missed, and at high altitude men suffered from fatigue and the effects of insufficient oxygen. But when communication worked, a pair or a flight could operate as a single unit. German pilots also used radio and group tactics. They were not solitary knights, despite the way popular culture sometimes portrays them. Bf-109s and FW-190s operated in pairs, flights, and larger formations. The most dangerous attacks on bombers were prepared in advance. Units assembled, gained altitude, and tried to strike together in order to overwhelm the American escorts. That is why a scene in which one German ace, completely alone, happens to meet one Mustang, would oversimplify the real air war. Even when a duel became personal for a few seconds, other aircraft remained nearby. The American had to remember the German wingman, while the German had to consider the Mustang's possible cover. Any elegant trap could be ruined by the arrival of a third participant. That was also why American training placed so much emphasis on situational awareness. A pilot had to know more than the position of his target. He had to know where his leader was, the altitude of the formation, the direction home, the fuel remaining, and the likely position of other enemy aircraft. Movies often show aerial combat as a long pursuit between two airplanes. In reality, most firing opportunities lasted only seconds. A pilot saw a target, turned, tried to establish the proper lead, and almost immediately had to begin scanning the sky again. The longer he looked only forward, the more likely it became that another aircraft was already moving into position behind him. Famous aces were therefore valued not only for marksmanship or the ability to withstand high G-forces. Their greatest skill was understanding sooner than others how the situation would look several seconds later. The German veteran in our reconstruction tries to predict the young American's movement. The American wins because he recognizes that prediction and prepares an answer in advance. Tactical deception worked only when an opponent saw exactly the picture he had been meant to see. By pretending to be damaged, the German offered one simple explanation: "My aircraft can no longer fight." A well-trained American considered a second explanation as well. "The enemy wants me to come too close." He did not have to decide immediately which explanation was correct. He only had to act in a way that would keep him alive if the worst possibility proved true. That principle applied to many episodes of the air war. An experienced pilot did not always have to guess the enemy's exact intention. He preserved several options and refused to stake everything on one assumption. That was why altitude, separation, and support from a wingman mattered so much. They gave him time to correct a wrong decision. By the spring of 1944, this ability to preserve options was becoming one of the strengths of American fighter aviation. The United States did not enter the war with a ready answer to every problem. In 1942 and 1943, Americans paid for their own mistakes. They overestimated the defensive power of the bombers, lost formation, and were caught by more experienced opponents. But the experience gained did not remain only in the private memories of the men who came home. It was collected in reports, checked against gun camera footage, discussed in debriefings, and passed to new pilots. Manuals explicitly required tactics to be revised as the enemy changed his methods. A veteran could finish a combat tour and soon find himself standing in front of a room full of cadets. In that way, the knowledge of one man began working in dozens of cockpits. The Luftwaffe also knew how to learn, and for much of the war, it retained a dangerous core of experienced personnel. German pilots were not naive opponents who could be defeated by one new piece of equipment. Many understood advanced tactics, knew their aircraft extremely well, and exploited the mistakes of young Americans. By 1944, however, the two systems were moving in opposite directions. The United States was increasing training hours, fielding long-range fighters, and sending experienced men back to train replacements. Germany was losing veterans, shortening programs because of fuel shortages, and increasingly sending pilots into combat without enough time on their operational aircraft. The most important comparison was no longer between one famous German ace and one unknown American. It was between two different ways of turning experience into results on a mass scale. A German veteran might know more individual tricks. He might have survived several fronts and recognized an opponent's mistake almost instantly. But if Americans had already encountered his maneuver, there was a chance that it had been described in a report, passed to an instructor, and then taught to a young pilot who did not yet have a single confirmed victory. Now return to the opening reconstruction. The Bf-109 reduces speed and pretends to be damaged. For the German pilot, this is not an act of desperation. It is a calculation. He sees a fast P-51 behind him and assumes that the American wants too badly to finish the fight. If the Mustang comes only a little closer, an overshoot will become almost unavoidable. The American sees the pale trail, the lowered wing, and the descent. At the same time, he can see that the German aircraft remains under control. He does not have to be certain that it is a deception. He simply refuses to surrender all of his speed and altitude for one inviting target. The German begins the climbing turn. At that moment, the plan is fully revealed. If the American continues moving in the same plane, the Bf-109 will indeed have a chance to emerge behind him. The Mustang goes up. It is not a magic maneuver or an act of superhuman reflex. The pilot has left himself the ability to make that choice. He did not kill his speed directly behind the target, stare only through the gun sight, or allow the enemy to decide the moment of the fight. The Bf-109 completes the maneuver lower and slower. The American returns from above, moves into position for a short burst, and opens fire. After the hits, the German aircraft finally goes down for real. Then the P-51 returns to the bombers. That ending is what makes the scene suitable not only for an adventure story, but for a historical documentary. The victory is not explained by luck or by the American being a natural-born genius. It comes from the characteristics of the aircraft, the fundamentals of air combat, training, discipline, and an understanding of the mission. The German pilot's confidence may have destroyed him, but not because he had no reason to believe he was experienced. He probably had very good reasons. His error lay elsewhere. He assumed that a young opponent had to be unprepared, and that a familiar trick would remain unknown to the American. By 1944, that was becoming an increasingly dangerous assumption. American aviation did not win every fight. Its pilots continued to be shot down, and German veterans remained dangerous until the final months of the war. But the United States was becoming increasingly effective at something especially important in a long conflict, turning the hard-earned experience of individual men into training for thousands of others. The title of this story can therefore be understood literally. A German ace tried to fool an American, and the American pretended to fall for it. But far more stood behind those few seconds. There were years of developing air tactics, training fields, fuel for hundreds of hours in the air, instructors with combat experience, mission debriefings, gun cameras, teamwork between leaders and wingmen, and long-range fighters that could now escort the bombers deep into Germany. The German pilot thought he was trying to outplay one young man. In reality, he had come up against a system that already knew many of the old tricks and was developing new answers every month.